They saw a black woman standing alone in a courtroom. No robe, no gavel, no warning. To them, she was nothing but a shadow in their world of power, so they treated her like nothing. Officer Mark Dalton thought he could humiliate her, silence her with a slap heard across the marble walls. He thought he could erase her dignity in front of everyone. He thought wrong, because Naomi Reed wasn't a bystander. She wasn't another silent face they could crush and forget. She was the judge. And in less than 4 minutes, everything they had built, the lies, the arrogance, the fake respect began to crack, splinter, and fall apart like glass under pressure. This isn't a story about anger. This isn't a story about revenge. This is a story about silent power, about what happens when strength doesn't scream it stands, about what it means to wear a hoodie not for hiding, but for armor. Today, we remember you can try to erase a black story. You can try to silence a black voice, but truth has its own gavel, and when it strikes, it doesn't whisper, it roars. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The courthouse of Harbor Bay stood cold and gray against the morning sky, its ancient stone pillars casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Inside, the halls echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps, rustling papers, and whispered judgments passed from mouth to mouth. It was a place where appearances meant power, and silence was mistaken for weakness. Naomi Reed moved through the front entrance with her head down. Her faded gray hoodie pulled up loosely over her silver-streaked hair. The badge clipped discreetly inside her pocket remained hidden, and she preferred it that way. Let them assume, let them guess. Today, she was not here to announce herself. Today, she was here to watch, to listen, to remind herself what the ground looked like before stepping onto the bench above it. The security guards barely glanced at her. No formal greetings, no courteous nods like they gave the men in polished shoes and sharp suits. Naomi's sneakers scuffed softly against the marble floor as she passed under the towering rotunda. The faint scent of dust and old paper thickened the air. To them, she was just another black woman with a worn backpack, maybe waiting for a case to be called, maybe lost. No one looked twice, and that was exactly how she wanted it. As she approached courtroom 3, she caught a glimpse of the man already stationed inside Officer Mark Dalton. He leaned casually against the prosecution table, arms folded, radiating entitlement like heat waves off hot concrete. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, heavy badge gleaming, Dalton was the kind of man who wore his power like a weapon and wielded it recklessly. Naomi paused just outside the door, pulling in a slow breath, her instincts sharpened like a blade unsheathed. There was tension in the air, a kind she knew too well. Trouble was coming. Inside, the early arrivals filled the benches, young attorneys checking their phones, a local reporter fiddling with a camera, 2 security officers whispering by the back wall. The atmosphere was casual, careless. After all, it was just another bond hearing, just another poor kid caught tagging a building, just another day of business as usual. Naomi slipped into the room without announcement. No robe, no gavel, no protection, and nobody cared. Not yet. She made her way quietly to the clerk's desk where a slim file waited. Her hand brushed against the edge of it, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility inside. Before she could open it, a harsh voice sliced through the hum of conversation. "Hey, you." She looked up slowly. Dalton was staring at her, eyebrows raised, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You lost or something?" He sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. A few heads turned, but most people just smiled awkwardly and looked away. After all, what was one more casual humiliation in a room like this? Naomi said nothing. She just stood still, the file in her hand, her gaze cool and unreadable. Dalton pushed off the table and swaggered toward her. "Court staff are supposed to wait outside until called," he said, his voice dripping with mock authority. "Rules matter around here." "Sweetheart," Naomi's eyes didn't flicker. She could feel the heat of every glance in the room now. Some amused, some embarrassed, none willing to intervene. Dalton was close enough now that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath, close enough that the heavy weight of his arrogance pressed against her like a physical force. "I said, rules matter," he repeated, louder this time. His hand twitched slightly at his side. Naomi didn't move. She didn't flinch. The air between them stretched thin, crackling with unspoken defiance. Dalton, sensing that his audience was watching, let out a low chuckle. "Tough one, huh?" he mocked, stepping even closer, and then without warning, the sound of an open hand cracking against skin shattered the room. A slap, sharp, casual, delivered with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times before and never faced a consequence. Naomi's head turned slightly from the impact, but her body remained still as stone. The courtroom froze. Papers stopped rustling. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the humming fluorescent lights seemed to dim under the weight of what had just happened. Naomi slowly straightened her spine. Her cheeks stung, a bright line of heat tracing the path of Dalton's palm, but she didn't reach up to touch it. She didn't stagger. She didn't shrink. Instead, she simply looked at him. A look so calm, so measured, so terrifying in its silence that Dalton actually took a small step back without realizing it. Somewhere at the back of the courtroom, a phone clicked on a camera lens capturing everything. The whisper of recorded evidence floated through the charged air. Dalton, emboldened by habit, didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care, because in his mind, Naomi Reed was nobody, just another black woman he could dismiss with a shove and a smirk. He had no idea. No idea at all, but he would. Soon, very soon. Dalton crossed his arms, puffing out his chest like a man daring someone to challenge him. The smirk was still on his lips, but a flicker of something uncertain flashed in his eyes. Naomi Reed watched him, unblinking. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one knew what to say. No one dared to move. Naomi could feel the weight of their eyes on her, not with sympathy, but with calculation. Was she going to scream, cry? Would she crumble like they expected her to? She simply turned away, without a word. Naomi walked calmly to the judge's bench, her sneakers silent against the polished floor. Each step echoed like a drumbeat in the courtroom's hollow chest. Dalton frowned, watching her movements, his brain struggling to piece together what was happening. "Hey," he barked. "I'm talking to you." Naomi didn't respond. She stepped behind the elevated platform, resting her hand lightly on the dark oak bench. Dalton's voice rose, sharp and full of misplaced authority. "You don't belong up there." "That's for—" He stopped. The words caught in his throat as Naomi reached into her backpack and pulled out a simple black robe. She unfolded it slowly, carefully, letting the heavy fabric fall with solemn grace. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a declaration. In front of every soul in that room, Naomi Reed slipped the robe over her hoodie, over the scars of 1,000 small humiliations, over the sting that still burned on her cheek. When she looked up again, she wasn't just a black woman in a hoodie anymore. She was the law. The realization hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the benches. The reporter's camera clicked rapidly. The young defense attorney at the side table froze mid-note. Dalton's face drained of color. He stumbled back a step, opening his mouth as if to explain, to excuse, to erase what he had just done, but no words came out. Naomi stood tall behind the bench, her hands steady on the gavel resting before her. In a voice that was calm, cold, and impossibly powerful, She spoke for the first time. "Officer Dalton," she said, her tone cutting through the silence like a blade. "Is this how you treat officers of the court?" The entire room flinched. Dalton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I didn't know," he stammered. "I thought." Naomi raised one hand, and the excuses died on his lips. "Ignorance," she said softly, "is not a defense. Not here. Not today." One of the security officers at the back, a younger man with wide, fearful eyes, instinctively reached for his radio. The other officer simply stood still, as if rooted to the floor. Naomi's gaze swept the courtroom, taking in every face. The journalists scribbling madly, the attorneys frozen in shock, the gallery holding its collective breath. Then her eyes returned to Dalton. "You assaulted a sitting judge in her courtroom," she said, her voice unwavering, "without provocation, without cause, in front of witnesses and under surveillance." Dalton shook his head, a thin sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. "I didn't mean I thought you were." You didn't look like. He stopped himself, realizing too late how deep the hole had become. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her brown eyes never leaving his. "I didn't look like what?" "Officer Dalton." Dalton's lips trembled. The silence stretched painfully. "Say it." Naomi thought, say what you really believe. But he didn't, because he knew. Everyone knew. Naomi straightened again, her hands folding neatly in front of her on the bench. "Bailiff," she said, her voice slicing through the air. "Secure the footage from courtroom security, all angles." Immediately, the younger security guard moved as if snapped from a trance, scurrying toward the control room. "As for you, Officer Dalton," Naomi continued, "you will remain present for the record. No sudden movements, no further insults to the dignity of this court." Dalton stood frozen, his arrogance collapsing inward like a building with rotted beams. The gavel rested quietly beside Naomi's hand, untouched, unnecessary. She didn't need to slam it down. She didn't need to raise her voice. The power was already hers, because real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to stand tall, steady, and unbreakable, even in a gray hoodie, especially in a gray hoodie. And Naomi Reed was all of that and more. In the shocked stillness of the courtroom, something deeper began to shift, a crack in the old walls. A whisper of something the marble and steel had tried for decades to silence. Respect. Real respect. Not because they were told to give it, but because they knew they had no choice. Not anymore. Naomi sat back in the high-back chair, her presence commanding without force. The black robe draped over her hoodie moved slightly with each calm breath she took. She watched Dalton fidget like a trapped animal, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, sweat beating at his temples. The bailiff returned, clutching a small device linked to the courtroom's security feed. He handed it carefully to Naomi, his hands trembling slightly. She didn't miss the look in his eyes, a mixture of fear, shame, and something else, admiration. Naomi placed the device gently beside her on the bench without looking at it. The evidence was already burned into the room, etched into the air between them. She didn't need to press play. Everyone had seen, everyone had heard. The stain of what had happened could never be scrubbed away. She leaned forward slightly, hands clasped together. "For the record," she said, her voice smooth as riverstone, "Officer Dalton is now under investigation for assaulting a sitting judge in a court of law, effective immediately. He is suspended from duty pending a full review." Dalton opened his mouth, desperate to object, to deny, to escape, but the words died in his throat. There was no oxygen left in the room for his lies. The silence held him captive. Naomi turned her gaze to the gallery. The young journalist with the camera had tears in her eyes, though she wiped them away quickly. The public defender, a woman barely out of law school, sat frozen, gripping her notepad as if it were a lifeline. The teenage defendant in the orange jumpsuit stared wide-eyed at Naomi, something like hope flickering in his face. Naomi saw it, and she remembered why she was here. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about all the moments before this, the unseen slights, the unspoken doubts, the thousand tiny cuts that bled a person invisible. And it was about everyone watching now, seeing, maybe for the first time, that dignity could not be stripped away by hands or by slaps or by hate. It could only be surrendered. And Naomi Reed had surrendered nothing. Not today. Not ever. She stood up slowly, the heavy robes settling around her shoulders like a mantle. "This court will take a recess," she announced, her voice firm, filling every dusty corner of the room. "Officer Dalton, remain seated until further instruction." Dalton stumbled into a chair, his face ashen, his hands shaking. The rest of the courtroom rose in stunned silence as Naomi descended the steps from the bench. She walked past Dalton without a glance, past the attorneys, past the reporters, past the marble pillars that had once seemed so cold and unreachable. Her hoodie framed her face like a quiet banner, not a symbol of defiance, not even a symbol of anger, a symbol of survival. Outside the courthouse, the sun had risen higher, casting a sharp light across the steps. Naomi paused at the heavy double doors. For a moment, she let the sunlight wash over her, warm and blinding. And then she pushed the doors open and stepped into the world beyond. The city stirred at her feet, cars humming, pigeons fluttering, voices calling in the distance. Life moved on, indifferent. But inside that courthouse, something had shifted, and it would not shift back. Not after today, not after her. As Naomi Reed walked down the courthouse steps, slow and steady, her hoodie catching the breeze, a quiet power moved with her, unseen, unstoppable, a silent revolution. The kind that doesn't need a single scream to shatter a system, the kind that doesn't ask for permission to exist, the kind that, once awakened, can never be caged again. She didn't look back. She didn't have to, because behind her, inside those stone walls, the old rules were already crumbling, and in their place, a new truth was being written, not in marble, not in gold leaf, but in something far stronger, in dignity, in silence, in the unstoppable presence of a Black woman who refused to disappear. Naomi Reed disappeared into the crowd, her gray hoodie blending into the sea of people, just another face among many, but the air around her carried a new weight, now a quiet, relentless force, and somewhere, deep inside the marble hall she had left behind, the echo of her presence still rang, soft, certain, unbreakable. The rumors began before Naomi even reached her car. Inside the courthouse, the whispers twisted and multiplied, carried by people too frightened to speak aloud and too cowardly to stay silent. A Black woman in a hoodie had humiliated one of Harbor Bay's finest. A nobody had dared to stand taller than a legacy officer. It didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. The next morning, Naomi arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The air was heavy, thicker than before, as if the building itself resented her return. Security guards who once nodded politely now averted their eyes. The clerk at the entrance handed her the docket with stiff fingers, his gaze glued to the floor. Naomi said nothing. She did not ask for smiles. She did not beg for acceptance. She had walked through worse storms than this. But she noticed every glance, every hesitation, every subtle act of dismissal. They were the first warning shots, silent but sharp. By noon, the real shots came. In courtroom 2, where she was scheduled to hear a preliminary hearing, the court reporter conveniently forgot to turn on the recording device. A small thing, an excusable mistake, but Naomi knew better. Later, A set of case files Naomi had personally reviewed disappeared from the judge's desk, only to be found hours later misplaced. They said with key documents mysteriously missing, paper cuts, all of them, individually insignificant. Together, they formed a clear message. You are not welcome here. She moved through it like mist, silent, untouchable. Dalton, suspended and seething, wasn't idle either. Through whispered channels and old alliances, he spread his own version of the story, a story where he had been blindsided, disrespected, provoked. He painted Naomi not as a judge wronged, but as an agitator who had embarrassed a loyal officer just doing his job. The narrative caught fire among those desperate to believe it. Some said she was too emotional to sit on the bench. Some whispered about a supposed history of attitude and defiance. Some just muttered the old poison in new words. It's not about race. They said it's about respect. Naomi watched it unfold with the patience of someone who had seen this game before. The rules never changed. Only the players did. She stayed silent. Not because she didn't see, not because she didn't hurt, but because she understood real power doesn't flinch at the first strike. It absorbs the blow. It waits. It sharpens. Still, the isolation grew heavier with each passing day. Lunchtime once meant quiet conversations with clerks and fellow judges in the cramped staff kitchen. Now, Naomi found herself sitting alone, the room buzzing with conversation she was never invited into. When she spoke during meetings, people shifted in their chairs, their eyes sliding past her as if she were a ghost. At case reviews, objections came faster, loud or small, baseless challenges thrown at her rulings like pebbles at a wall. Naomi let each one hit and fall away. She would not give them what they wanted. She would not give them rage. She would not give them tears. She would give them only what they feared most, her presence. One afternoon, as she walked through the underground parking garage, Naomi heard hurried footsteps behind her. She paused, listening carefully, her instincts prickling. A voice called out, "Hey, Judge Reed." She turned slowly to see Officer Harris, one of Dalton's known loyalists, jogging toward her. His uniform was immaculate, his badge gleaming under the dim yellow lights. Harris stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily, a forced smile on his face. "Just wanted to say, no hard feelings," he said, his tone oily. "You know, about everything." Naomi regarded him coolly, saying nothing. Harris shifted awkwardly, then added, "Some people just don't understand how things work around here. It's nothing personal. You should maybe keep your head down for a while. Could be easier for everybody." The threat hung in the air, thinly disguised. Naomi smiled, then not wide, not warm, a smile as sharp and cold as broken glass. "Thank you for your concern, Officer Harris," she said, her voice steady. "But I do not keep my head down, not for anyone." She turned and continued walking, her footsteps slow, deliberate, echoing through the cavernous space behind her. Harris stood frozen for a long moment before cursing under his breath and stalking away. Naomi reached her car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. For a few moments, she sat there in the silence, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The hoodie brushed against her neck, a familiar weight, a reminder you are not invisible. They see you. They fear you. They strike first because they are afraid of what will happen when you strike back. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a slow breath. This was only the beginning, and they had no idea how much strength she had left in reserve. Not yet, but they would. The days that followed were not marked by open confrontation. No one dared to challenge Naomi Reed directly. Instead, they used the old weapons, the subtle ones, the ones designed to wear you down without leaving bruises. Her cases were reassigned without explanation. Important memos and updates somehow never made it to her desk. When she entered a room, conversations faltered and shifted, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. It was not the first time Naomi had been made to feel unwelcome. It would not be the last, but she felt the growing storm behind each small cruelty. She knew what they were building: a foundation of excuses, a pile of tiny complaints, enough to make her seem unstable, unfit, enough to give them permission to push her out without ever saying why. They were setting the stage, preparing the crowd, sharpening the knives, and Naomi watched them do it all with calm, steady eyes. Late one evening, long after the courtrooms had emptied and the fluorescent lights buzzed low overhead, Naomi sat alone in her chambers. Stacks of case files surrounded her, each one a life waiting for a decision, a future balanced on the edge of her pen. She rubbed her temples, feeling the fatigue seeping into her bones. But it was not the cases that tired her. It was the knowledge that every move she made was now under a microscope. Every ruling would be twisted, every decision questioned, every slip magnified. They were daring her to stumble. She closed the file in front of her and leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling where a faint water stain spread like a dark cloud. A knock sounded at her door. Naomi straightened instantly, her instincts razor sharp. "Come in," she said, her voice even. The door opened and a man stepped inside. Assistant District Attorney Evan Burke Young. Ambitious, all sharp suits and sharper smiles. "Judge Reed," he said with a brightness that was just a little too forced. "Sorry to bother you so late. Just wanted to drop off some paperwork. Important stuff. Urgent." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and set a thick envelope on her desk. Naomi raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Burke hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He was waiting for something, a reaction, permission, or maybe forgiveness. When Naomi offered nothing, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "You know," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "there's a lot of chatter around the building. People are nervous about what Naomi asked." Keeping her tone neutral, Burke gave a small, theatrical shrug. "Changes, tensions, you know how it is." She stared at him, unblinking. He shifted again, visibly uncomfortable, just saying, "Maybe it would be easier on everyone if things calmed down a little. If we could all just move past what happened." There it was. The offer wrapped in faux concern. Be quiet. Be small. Let it go. Naomi smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made Burke's own falter. "The law is not a convenience store, Mr. Burke," she said softly. "We do not pick and choose what to enforce based on what makes people comfortable." Burke flushed, his mouth opening and closing before he managed a weak laugh. "Of course, Judge. Of course. Just thinking out loud." He gathered himself quickly and retreated, practically stumbling over his own feet in his haste to leave. Naomi sat back, watching the door click shut behind him. She knew that visit for what it was: a test, a warning, a reminder that she was surrounded not by colleagues but by opportunists who would happily shove her into the fire to save themselves. And yet she felt no fear, because Naomi Reed understood something they had forgotten. Real power is not given. It is claimed. And once claimed, it becomes part of you, stitched into your very bones. They could not take it, not with whispers, not with rumors, not even with lies. Outside her window, the city lights flickered against the night sky, 1,000 tiny points of stubborn fire refusing to be swallowed by the dark. Naomi turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into shadow. She sat there for a long moment, feeling the quiet hum of the courthouse all around her. And then, slowly, deliberately, she rose. Tomorrow, they would strike harder. Tomorrow, They would sharpen their blades to a finer edge. Let them. Naomi Reed had already survived storms they could not even imagine. She would survive this one too. And when the dust finally settled, when the last whisper faded into silence, they would remember why they had feared the black woman in the hoodie, not because she was angry, not because she was loud, but because she stood, and because she never, ever bowed. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, with a mist clinging low over Harbor Bay. Naomi Reed stood by her kitchen window, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, her hoodie drawn tight around her shoulders. The city beyond the glass looked muted, almost blurred, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She had not slept much, but she did not feel tired. She felt sharpened. By the time she pulled into the courthouse parking garage, the tension was palpable. Even the concrete walls seemed to hum with quiet hostility. As she walked toward the elevator, heads turned. Some quickly looked away. Others stared openly, their eyes filled with thinly veiled contempt. The silent strikes had grown sharper overnight. In the main lobby, Naomi paused, sensing movement just out of view. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse. Two court officers stood huddled near the security checkpoint, their voices low but urgent. She could not hear their words, but she knew the language well enough, the language of resentment, the language of fear dressed up as righteousness. As she approached the entrance to courtroom 3, she found it blocked. A maintenance sign had been hastily thrown across the door. Wet paint. It read in crooked black letters. Naomi said nothing. She simply moved to the adjacent courtroom, where a junior clerk stood uncertainly. The girl's hands trembled as she handed Naomi a new docket, one Naomi had not assigned, filled with cases she had no business presiding over. Another silent blow, another attempt to unsettle her, another message: you are not welcome here. Naomi met the girl's frightened eyes and gave a small, measured nod. Thank you, she said simply. No anger, no protest. The girl blinked in surprise, then turned away quickly, almost guiltily. Inside the substitute courtroom, the air felt wrong. The benches were sparsely filled with defendants, attorneys, and a few officers she recognized, Dalton's friends, men who watched her with cold amusement. The game was not subtle anymore. As Naomi took her seat behind the bench, one of the officers, a tall man with a thick mustache and an even thicker air of entitlement, shifted dramatically in his chair, deliberately leaning back, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. The clerk cleared her throat nervously and called the first case. Naomi listened carefully, ruling precisely, speaking with the clarity and authority that had taken her decades to hone. But every word she spoke was met with whispers. Every decision was followed by exaggerated sighs, murmured jokes, barely concealed mockery. They wanted her to crack, to lash out, to prove their whispered accusations right. Naomi kept her voice calm and deliberate. Each ruling was a stone laid carefully, building something they could not tear down, no matter how hard they tried. Still, the strikes kept coming. A bailiff accidentally spilled coffee on her notes. An attorney loudly questioned her understanding of basic procedure, forcing Naomi to correct him sharply in front of everyone. A defense lawyer smirked and muttered under his breath as he passed by, probably just another diversity hire. It was 100 small wounds, each meant to bleed her dry. By midday, the weight pressed heavily against her chest. Not fear, not even anger. Grief. Grief for a system that still fought so hard to choke the dignity from anyone who dared to stand where she stood. Grief for the young black girls who would watch her story and wonder if it was even worth trying. But Naomi Reed was not built to yield. She called the final case of the morning, her voice steady. A young man shuffled forward, maybe 19 years old, thin, shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. As he raised his head, their eyes met. For a second, just a second, Naomi saw herself at that age. Hungry, determined, tired of fighting for every inch of respect. She offered him a small nod. Barely perceptible, something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. The weight did not lift, but he stood a little taller. The officers lining the courtroom noticed. Their faces darkened, because dignity, once glimpsed, is contagious, and they could not allow that. As Naomi finished the hearing and rose from her seat, she felt it coming, the final strike of the day, a low cough, a muttered comment, just loud enough for the room to hear. Bet she thinks that robe makes her better than the rest of us. It was a throwaway line, a pebble tossed casually at the mountain they could never climb. Naomi turned her head slowly, letting her gaze sweep the room, not with anger, not with shame, but with a quiet, merciless knowing. She said nothing. She did not need to, because when you wear your story like armor, when your silence is louder than their insults, you become something they cannot destroy. You become inevitable. As Naomi stepped through the heavy wooden doors and back into the dim hallway, she allowed herself a single thought. Let them strike, let them whisper, let them build their walls higher and higher. She was not here to climb over them. She was here to walk right through. And nothing, not their stares, not their schemes, not even their fear would stop her. It did not take long before the private whispers turned into public blows. The first real hit came not inside the courtroom, but in the wide-open space of the courthouse cafeteria, a place where reputations were built and destroyed over plastic trays and lukewarm coffee. Naomi Reed entered that morning with her head held high, her hoodie tucked under her judicial robe, her stride steady despite the invisible weights tied to her ankles. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual noise, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of attorneys trading favors, the clatter of officers gossiping over half-eaten sandwiches. But as Naomi stepped into the room, a strange hush fell across the tables. It was not complete silence. It was something worse, a buzzing quiet, full of fake smiles and sidelong glances. She moved toward the counter without hesitation, grabbed a simple sandwich and a bottle of water, and made her way to a far table, one usually left empty. But today, as she crossed the floor, a voice called out, loud, mocking, deliberate, "Look who thinks she runs the place." Naomi stopped mid-step, the words hanging in the stale cafeteria air. She turned her head slightly, not enough to engage, just enough to register the faces. 3 officers seated together, all in uniform, all smiling wide, tight smiles that did not reach their eyes. One of them, Officer Simmons, an old ally of Dalton's, leaned back in his chair and clapped slowly. A slow, sarcastic applause that drew chuckles from nearby tables. The noise spread like ripples on dirty water. A few attorneys laughed. A few more looked down, pretending not to notice. No one intervened. Naomi said nothing. She walked to her table, set down her tray, and sat with careful, deliberate grace. She unwrapped her sandwich as if the world around her were silent, as if she had not just been made a spectacle, as if she were still in control, because she was. But humiliation does not require violence. It only needs an audience willing to watch and do nothing. And today, the audience was eager. Halfway through her meal, the second blow landed. A young intern, no more than 20, with nervous hands and a shiny ID badge, stumbled toward Naomi's table, holding a slip of paper. "Judge Reed," he said awkwardly. You dropped this." Naomi frowned slightly. She had dropped nothing. She accepted the paper, unfolded it, and read the scrawled message. "Better know your place before we put you back in it. No name, no signature, just the threat, laid bare in black ink." Across the room, a few heads tilted toward her, waiting, watching for the explosion, waiting for the crack. But Naomi folded the note carefully, tucked it into her pocket, and continued eating. Bite by bite, refusal by refusal, each act of calmness, another wall they could not breach. Still, the blows kept coming. Later that afternoon, as Naomi presided over a routine bail hearing, an attorney for the defense, a man who had once fawned over her rulings, stood up mid-session and declared loudly, "With all due respect, Your Honor, maybe someone else should handle this. Someone more experienced." The words hung in the air like a slap. The defendant, the spectators, even the court reporter froze. Naomi stared at the man for a long moment. She could see the tremor in his hands, the flicker of fear beneath his smug posture. He had not thought of this himself. He was carrying someone else's water, saying someone else's words. Naomi leaned forward, her voice steady. "Counselor," she said, "if you believe you are unable to perform your duties before this court, you are welcome to recuse yourself. Otherwise, I suggest you proceed before I find you in contempt." The man's cheeks flushed red. He mumbled an apology and stumbled through the rest of the hearing. His confidence shattered, but Naomi knew it was only the beginning. Public humiliation does not aim for victory. It aims for erosion, 1,000 small cracks, until one day the dam collapses and Naomi Reed could feel the water rising. That evening, in the parking garage, she found her car smeared with crude graffiti. Big black letters scrawled across the windshield. "Out of your league, girl." No cameras caught the act. No witnesses came forward. Of course not. The damage was meant to be personal, isolating, silent. Naomi stood there for a long moment, staring at the words. She felt the old temptation rise, the desire to scream, to rage, to demand justice. But she knew better. Rage would not save her. Dignity would. She pulled a tissue from her pocket and began wiping the glass clean. Stroke by slow, patient stroke, under the pale garage lights. The letters blurred and vanished, and Naomi Reed stood a little straighter, not because she was not hurt, but because she had already decided that nothing they did would ever define her, not the whispers, not the threats, not even the laughter, especially not the laughter. They thought humiliation would break her, but all it did was sharpen her edge. Tomorrow on, they would strike harder. Good. She was ready. By the end of that week, Naomi Reed's name was no longer just whispered in hallways. It was plastered across anonymous blogs, courthouse gossip pages, and thinly veiled newsletters circulated among staff. The headlines were cruel, the comments even worse. Is Harbor Bay ready for a radical judge? Bias on the bench when activism hides behind a robe. Should judges leave their hoodies at home? No one signed the articles. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew where they came from. Dalton's old friends, the officers who feared what Naomi represented, the lawyers who had been taught, generation after generation, that respect was something reserved for a certain kind of face, not hers. The articles twisted her story beyond recognition. They painted her not as a woman who had been assaulted, but as a troublemaker who had provoked a respected officer into losing control. They framed her silence as arrogance, her dignity as defiance, her strength as a threat. And it worked. Slowly, the tide of casual cruelty turned into open hostility. In court, attorneys interrupted her mid-sentence without reprimand. In meetings, her suggestions were met with blank stares or polite nods followed by swift dismissal. Even in the judge's lounge, once a place of cautious respect, Naomi found herself isolated, the conversation dying every time she entered. One afternoon, as she waited in line at a local coffee shop near the courthouse, two junior prosecutors stood behind her, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "I heard she only got that bench because the city wanted to meet a quota." "Yeah," said the other, snickering. Affirmative action strikes again. Naomi stiffened. her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. But she said nothing. She paid for her coffee, thanked the barista, and walked out without once acknowledging them. Because she knew every time they tried to humiliate her, they revealed their own fear, and fear made people sloppy. Later that same week, someone created a fake social media account under her name. It posted inflammatory messages, claiming that Naomi hated police officers, hated white people, hated the system she served. The posts were shared among courthouse employees, judges, and even local media. No one confronted her about it directly. No official inquiry was made. Instead, she was left to drown in the flood of side eyes and whispered judgments. Naomi documented everything: the fake posts, the graffiti, the misplaced files, the mocking notes, each insult, each attack. She recorded with the precision of a surgeon cataloging wounds, because she understood the deeper game now. They were not trying to defeat her in open court. They were trying to bury her beneath 1,000 cuts so small no one would notice she was bleeding until it was too late. But Naomi Reed was not bleeding. She was sharpening, and with each new act of humiliation, the blade grew keener. Late one evening, long after the courthouse emptied, Naomi sat in her chambers. The fake headlines spread before her like a crime scene. She leaned back in her chair, hoodie pulled close, her hands steepled under her chin. They thought they were breaking her, but all they were doing was teaching her where to strike when the time came. Her phone buzzed, a text message. No name attached, just a number she didn't recognize. It read, "You should resign before we make it worse." Naomi smiled grimly. Worse? They had no idea what worse looked like. She deleted the message without replying and turned her attention back to her work. Every file she reviewed, every case she prepared, every judgment she wrote was a testament to one simple fact: she was still here. They had thrown everything they had at her, the jokes, the threats, the lies. And yet, here she sat, robe neatly hung behind her chair, hoodie still wrapped around her like armor, hands steady on the tools of justice they had tried so hard to deny her. They could humiliate her in public. They could smear her name. They could poison the air around her, but they could not erase her. And every day she stood behind that bench. Every word she spoke into the official record was another crack in the wall they thought would hold forever. Tomorrow, they would try something bigger, something crueler, something meant to break more than just her reputation. Let them. Naomi Reed was not afraid of public humiliation. She had survived much worse in private, and she knew one truth that they would never understand. A hoodie does not make you small. A hoodie does not make you invisible. A hoodie makes you ready for the storm, for the fight, for the moment when you decide, once and for all, that their hatred is not your shame to carry, it is theirs to drown in. The real attack came on a Friday. The courthouse buzzed with its usual undercurrent of stress and stale coffee. But beneath it all, something different simmered, something meaner. Naomi Reed felt it as soon as she stepped through the heavy front doors. The sideways glances were sharper, the smirks bolder, the whispers louder. They were no longer just setting traps behind closed doors. Today, they wanted blood. As Naomi made her way toward her chambers, she noticed clusters of courthouse staff gathered around their phones, laughing in low, ugly bursts. Something inside her tightened. She reached her office without incident. But before she could close the door, her clerk, Maya, one of the few who had remained loyal, appeared, her face pale. "Judge Reed, you need to see this," she said, thrusting her phone forward. Naomi took the phone and stared at the screen. A video was playing, grainy, shaky footage, a poorly lit corner of the parking garage. The confrontation weeks ago when Naomi had calmly wiped graffiti off her car. But it was not just a recording. It had been edited, twisted. The video had been slowed, captioned with sneering text. Unstable judge meltdown. Is this who we trust with justice? Comments poured in beneath the post. Vicious and relentless. Crazy should be disbarred. Embarrassment to the bench. The video had already been shared hundreds of times across social media groups, courthouse forums, even local news sites that specialize in scandal more than truth. Naomi scrolled further and saw still images from inside the cafeteria. Distorted screenshots making her look isolated, angry, unstable. Each one was a lie carefully crafted to feel like truth. She set the phone down slowly. Maya's voice broke the silence. "We can trace it back," she said urgently. "Find out who posted it. We can get a statement out." Naomi shook her head. "Not yet." Maya hesitated. "Judge, they're trying to destroy you." "I know," Naomi said quietly, "and they are not finished." By mid-morning, the local radio station had picked up the story. A thinly veiled hit piece aired during the prime news hour, calling into question Naomi's temperament, her objectivity, her fitness to serve. Guests, some claiming to be anonymous court employees, called in with vague, baseless accusations about her attitude, her disrespect for tradition. They had sharpened their knives, and now they were swinging. Naomi sat through it all in her chambers, the radio playing softly in the background. Each insult landed like a hammer blow. But she did not flinch. She understood what this was now. It was not about a single slap in a courtroom. It was not about a hoodie or a headline. It was about power. It was about punishing her for daring to exist in a space they thought belonged to them. And it was about sending a message to anyone else who looked like her. Stay small, stay silent, or we will crush you. Just before her afternoon docket began, her supervisor, Judge Raymond Kent, knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. A white man in his 60s, Kent wore his authority like armor and his disdain like cologne. "Judge Reed," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Given the recent distractions, perhaps it would be best if you took a voluntary leave of absence just until things quiet down." Naomi looked up from her paperwork, meeting his gaze with calm precision. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Kent offered a tight smile. "Well," he said, "then we might be forced to initiate formal proceedings, questions of judicial conduct, fitness hearings, investigations." He let the threat hang in the air. Naomi folded her hands atop her desk. "Is there a formal complaint against me?" she asked, voice even. Kent shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet," he admitted, "but these things have a way of gathering momentum." Naomi leaned back in her chair, studying him. This was not a negotiation. It was a lynching disguised in paperwork. "Thank you for your suggestion, Judge Kent," she said smoothly, "but I will be presiding over my docket today." As scheduled, Kent's mouth tightened into a thin, colorless line. "As you wish," he said coldly, and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. Naomi sat in the stillness for a long moment, breathing deeply. They wanted her to walk away, to slink out in shame, to validate every lie they had spun, but she would not give them that. When she entered the courtroom that afternoon, the gallery was packed, not just with attorneys and defendants. There were reporters now, cameras tucked discreetly in bags, notepads flashing like weapons, waiting for her to crack, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for the story they had already written to come true. Naomi adjusted her robe, the soft gray hoodie still tucked beneath it, and stepped behind the bench. She looked out over the crowd. Let them watch. Let them record. She would give them something to see. Not a meltdown, not a collapse, but a woman standing taller than any lie they could invent. Because humiliation only works if you accept it. And Naomi Reed had never accepted anything she did not choose. They could not break her in the courtroom. They could not break her with whispers or stage humiliations. So they decided to break her somewhere even crueler. Outside. It started the following Monday. Naomi Reed stepped into the morning light, hoodie pulled snug under her black robe, briefcase in hand. The courthouse looked the same on the surface: gray walls, dusty steps, metal detectors humming softly at the entrance. But the crowd outside was different. They were not defendants or jurors or court employees. They were protesters, and their signs were sharp enough to pierce the skin. Fire the radical judge. Justice. Not hoodies. Protect our courts. Some had Naomi's face blown up on poster board, but twisted, photoshopped, manipulated until she barely looked human. Others held signs dripping with slogans, too old and too venomous to be creative. She heard the shouts before she even reached the steps. Go back where you came from. We do not need criminals in robes. The police stood nearby, arms crossed, stone-faced, doing nothing. Of course they were doing nothing. Naomi walked through the gauntlet without slowing, her heels striking the concrete in sharp, steady rhythm. Each step said what her voice did not. I am here. I am not afraid. I will not move for you. Inside the courthouse, it got worse. By mid-morning, an email spread through official court channels. Anonymous sender. Anonymous claims. It accused Naomi of judicial misconduct, bribes, bias, abuse of power, wild, baseless accusations, but ones designed carefully to sound just plausible enough. By noon, a second email circulated, this time with evidence. Photos, doctored, grainy photos, supposedly showing Naomi meeting with radical activists in dark parking lots. Images so poorly faked a child could have spotted the edits. But truth was not the point. Doubt was the point, and doubt, once planted, spreads like mold through walls. Naomi sat in her chambers as her clerk, Maya, read the messages aloud, her voice shaking with anger. This is illegal, Maya said fiercely. This is defamation. We can fight this. Naomi looked at her calmly. We will, but not today. Today we endure. Maya slammed her hand on the desk, tears brimming in her eyes. They cannot get away with this. Naomi reached across the desk and squeezed her hand gently. They are not getting away with it. They are just showing us who they have always been. That afternoon, things escalated again. As Naomi walked toward the courtroom, a man stepped out from the crowd lining the hallway. He was tall, heavy-set, wearing a security uniform, but Naomi recognized him instantly. He was no official courthouse guard. He was one of Dalton's men, the ones who thought the badge on their chest gave them license to do anything. The man bumped into her roughly, knocking her briefcase from her hand. Watch it, he snarled loudly, loud enough for the nearby gallery to hear. Crazy woman. The briefcase burst open on the floor. Papers spilled out, case files, handwritten notes, neatly prepared judgments. The hallway froze for a long, tense moment. No one moved. No one helped. Naomi bent down slowly, gathering the papers one by one with steady hands. Her robe brushed the floor. Her hoodie framed her face in soft, stubborn folds. The man loomed over her, sneering. Another phone lifted somewhere behind him, recording, waiting. Naomi gathered the last paper, rose to her full height, and turned to face him. Their eyes locked. The man smirked, expecting fear. Instead, Naomi spoke calmly, her voice carrying across the silent hall. You are out of uniform, sir, and out of line. The man flinched, but covered it quickly with a bark of false laughter. She stepped closer, never raising her voice. Get back where you belong, she said, each word deliberate. You are dismissed. He hesitated, uncertain now, unnerved, because Naomi was not shouting. She was not begging. She was commanding, and real authority does not need volume to be heard. Finally, the man muttered something under his breath and slunk back into the crowd. leaving Naomi standing alone, papers in hand, dignity intact. But she knew this was not the end. They had crossed the line. They would not stop now. As she walked into the courtroom, the gavel heavy in her hand, Naomi understood the full weight of what was happening. They did not want to embarrass her anymore. They wanted to destroy her career, destroy her name, destroy the idea that someone like her, someone wearing a hoodie, someone carrying the bloodlines they tried so hard to erase could ever sit in judgment over them. But it was too late. She was already here, and she was not leaving. No matter what they threw next, because Naomi Reed knew something they had forgotten. You cannot erase a storm by shouting at the sky. You cannot erase a voice by throwing stones. And you cannot erase a woman who has already decided that her story will be heard with or without their permission. The meeting was called for late afternoon, behind closed doors, no official notice, no formal invitation, just a quiet whisper passed from office to office. Be there. It's about Reed. Naomi heard about it from Maya an hour before it began. They think you won't show, Maya said, her voice tight with anger. They think you'll hide. Naomi placed her file neatly into her briefcase. Her hands were steady, her voice even. Then let's disappoint them. When she arrived outside the conference room, the hallway was nearly empty, only a few scattered staff, pretending not to watch. Naomi adjusted her robe, her hoodie still resting beneath like a second skin, and pushed the door open without knocking. Inside, a half circle of power waited. Judges, senior clerks, administrators, people who had smiled to her face and sharpened knives behind her back. At the center of it all sat Judge Kent, his hands folded over a thick file stuffed with papers. He looked up as Naomi entered, offering a thin, brittle smile. Judge Reed, he said smoothly, thank you for joining us. Naomi took a seat at the end of the long table, her back straight, her face calm. She placed her briefcase beside her chair and folded her hands in front of her. No apology, no explanation, no fear. Kent cleared his throat and launched into the performance. There are concerns, he began, about recent disruptions to courthouse operations, about public trust, about the dignity of the judiciary. Naomi said nothing. The others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, emboldened now that the ambush had begun, one by one. They voiced their complaints, anonymous reports, rumors of unprofessional behavior, concerns about impartiality, no facts, no charges, just smoke and shadow. Naomi listened, her expression unchanging, because she understood this was not about her conduct. It was about her presence. It was about a black woman in a hoodie who refused to apologize for existing. Finally, Kent leaned forward, tapping the thick file in front of him. Given the climate, he said delicately, we believe it would be best for all parties if you considered stepping down voluntarily. He smiled again, that same thin, reptilian smile. Naomi leaned back in her chair, studying the faces around her. She saw fear. She saw resentment. She saw desperation. But most of all, she saw weakness. Because power built on exclusion is brittle. It shatters under its own weight. She spoke softly, but every word struck the air like a hammer. You want me gone because I make you uncomfortable, she said. You want me silent because my very existence exposes your prejudice. Murmurs rippled around the room. Naomi continued, her voice gaining strength. You have fabricated stories, circulated lies, staged public humiliations, and yet, here I sit, still standing, still judging, still refusing to become small enough to fit inside your narrow view of who deserves to hold a seat. Kent's smile faltered. Judge Reed, this isn't personal. It is always personal. Naomi cut in sharply. It has been personal since the first day you decided that the color of my skin, the weight of my name, and the fabric of my hoodie made me less worthy than you. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Naomi rose from her chair, gathering her briefcase. "If you wish to remove me," she said, "do it openly. Do it with charges and hearings and a public record. Force the truth into the light. Because I promise you this, I will not resign. I will not retreat, and I will not be erased. Not by whispers, not by lies, not by cowards gathered in secret." She met each pair of eyes around the table, steady, unblinking. "You will have to tear this robe from my shoulders," she finished. "And even then, you will never strip away the authority I carry inside me." Without waiting for a response, Naomi turned and walked from the room. The door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click. Outside, the courthouse felt different. The air was colder, sharper. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. Naomi Reed knew the storm would come harder now, knew the attacks would grow more vicious, but she also knew something else. They had shown their hand too soon. They had exposed their fear, and fear was a weakness she could use. As she walked down the hallway, the whispers swirled behind her like smoke. But Naomi did not look back. She did not slow. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but it was hers, and she would walk it. Hoodie up, head high, footsteps echoing against the walls of a system that had tried and failed to make her disappear. The courthouse walls could not contain it anymore. The rumors, the lies, the hatred had spilled into the streets now, leaking through cracks they had spent years pretending did not exist. Within days of Naomi Reed's refusal to step down, the protests outside the courthouse doubled, then tripled. They came with bullhorns now, their voices amplified into the sky. "No radical judges, justice. Not politics, save our courts." It didn't matter that Naomi had never once brought politics into her courtroom. It didn't matter that her rulings were textbook examples of fairness and restraint. Facts were no longer the weapon of choice. Fear was. And fear, once unleashed, becomes a wildfire. She felt it on her way to work, walking the gauntlet of angry faces twisted in rage. She felt it inside the courthouse, as more and more of her colleagues refused to meet her gaze. Even the defendants seemed different now, hesitant, wary, as if her robe had become a costume instead of a badge of honor. And Naomi knew why. The whisper campaign had evolved into something uglier. They said she was dangerous. They said she hated the police. They said she would free criminals just to make a point. They said it loud enough that people began to believe it, or at least to act like they did. One morning, Naomi arrived at her chambers to find the door vandalized. Someone had scratched words deep into the wood, carving so hard the splinters flared out like tiny wounds. Unfit, unworthy, unwelcome. Maintenance scrubbed at it for hours, but the scars remained. Naomi ran her fingers over the rough marks, feeling the grooves against her skin. They wanted to mark her, to brand her, to make sure she never forgot she was an outsider in their world. But they forgot something. Naomi Reed had never been inside their world to begin with. She had built her own, and she was not about to surrender it now. The final blow of the week came during a live news segment. She hadn't planned to watch it. Maya had begged her not to, but Naomi believed in facing the storm head-on, so she sat in her small living room that night, hoodie wrapped tight around her, and watched as the local news anchor introduced a breaking investigation, exclusive footage. They called it secret recordings, anonymous sources, allegations of judicial misconduct. The screen filled with choppy, grainy video footage of Naomi speaking at a private community event months ago. Well before the attacks began, she had been encouraging young Black students to pursue law careers, to believe they belonged in rooms where decisions were made. But the footage had been edited, sliced, and rearranged to sound like she was calling for rebellion against the court system. It was a lie, an obvious, deliberate lie. But Naomi knew better than anyone perception often trumps reality. The news anchor's voice was solemn, grave. A formal inquiry has been requested. They announced Judge Naomi Reed's conduct will be reviewed for potential violations of judicial ethics. Formal, official. The machine had been set in motion. Maya called seconds later. Her voice panicked. We can fight this. Judge, we can file motions. Demand a public hearing. We have rights. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then she answered, steady as ever. Yes, we have rights, and we will use every single one of them. But deep down, she knew this was no longer about clearing her name. It was about survival. It was about showing them that even when they came with lies and torches, with edited videos and sharpened tongues, they would not unmake her. Because Naomi Reed had built herself from fire and stone and silence. And she knew the truth. They had not crossed the line. They had erased it. And once you erase the line, you can no longer pretend you are civilized. You are just an attacker hiding behind a badge, behind a robe, behind a lie. That night, Naomi sat in the dark, the glow of the city painting long shadows across her walls. She was not naive. She knew the hardest battles were still ahead. They would smear her name. They would try to drag her from the bench. They would try to turn even the people she had sworn to protect against her. And still she would stand. Because dignity does not belong to the system. It belongs to those who refuse to surrender it. And Naomi Reed had never surrendered anything in her life. Not to fear, not to hatred, not to history, and certainly not to cowards who hid their fists behind fake headlines. Tomorrow, the fire would burn hotter. Tomorrow, they would come for her harder. Good. She would be ready. Because when you are forged by injustice, you do not fear the flames. You become them. It happened quietly, as most powerful things do. No announcements, no headlines, no marching band of promises, just a presence, a shadow that moved through the cracks they had forgotten to seal, a force no one had counted on because it had been silent for so long. His name was Elijah Reed, Naomi's father, a man most people had either forgotten or never dared to know. Elijah had built his life out of broken systems and broken promises, one brick at a time, one hard-earned victory after another. He had worn many titles: union leader, civil rights advocate, political strategist, but none defined him better than this protector. And when he heard what they were doing to his daughter, the old instincts woke up. He arrived at Harbor Bay on a Thursday morning. No entourage, no press conference, just a battered black Lincoln rolling slow through the courthouse parking lot, the city's dust clinging to its tires. When Elijah stepped out, people noticed, not because he was loud, but because something about him made noise without sound. He wore an old gray coat, a simple black scarf, boots scuffed from years of marches and midnight meetings, and his eyes sharp, heavy, unblinking, carried the weight of every battle he had ever fought and every war he had ever refused to lose. Naomi was in her chambers when Maya rushed in. Breathless, Judge Reed, someone's here to see you. Who? Naomi asked. Glancing up from a stack of case files, Maya hesitated, a strange look flickering across her face. He says he's your father. Naomi froze, not out of fear, not out of shame, out of memory. It had been years since Elijah had walked into her world like this, unannounced, undeniable. She rose slowly, smoothing the front of her robe, and walked toward the door. When she opened it, Elijah stood there, filling the hallway with his presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was both rough and tender, Elijah said, "You didn't think I was going to sit this one out, did you?" Naomi felt the tightness in her chest ease just a fraction. She stepped aside. "Come in, Daddy." He moved into the office, taking everything in with a glance, the papers, The files, the silent battles etched into the walls. He sat down across from her desk, folding his big hands in his lap. "Tell me everything," he said simply. Naomi did. She told him about the rumors, the lies, the protests, about the meeting behind closed doors, about the formal inquiry looming over her head like a guillotine. Elijah listened without interrupting, his face carved from stone. When she finished, he leaned forward slightly. "And you stood your ground." "I did," Naomi said. Elijah nodded, a small smile flickering across his lips. "Good. Now it's my turn." Naomi frowned. "Daddy, this is my fight," Elijah chuckled, low and rumbling. "Girl, every fight you're in, I'm in. That's how this works." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need saving, but she saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire she had inherited, and she understood. This wasn't about saving her. This was about standing beside her. And there was a difference. Elijah rose, adjusting his coat. "I won't get in your way," he said. "You keep doing what you do best. But outside that courtroom, that's my world." Naomi stood too, facing him across the worn carpet. "What are you planning?" He gave her that old, mischievous smile she remembered from childhood, the kind that usually meant someone was about to regret underestimating him. "I'm planning," he said, "to remind Harbor Bay who taught you how to fight." Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then she stepped forward and hugged him, not the quick, perfunctory hug of duty, a real one, tight, solid, unbreakable. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. "Always," he murmured against her hair. "Always." When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce, alive. "Let them come." "Naomi," he said, "they do not know the storm they just woke up." And with that, Elijah Reed turned and walked out of her office, his shoulders square, his stride steady, ready. Outside, the city buzzed with the latest rumors, the latest headlines, the latest lies. But something new stirred now, just beneath the surface, something ancient, something unafraid. The shadow had woken, and Harbor Bay would never be the same again. Elijah Reed did not waste time. While Naomi faced the storm inside the courthouse, Elijah moved through Harbor Bay like a silent current, unseen but unstoppable. He knew where the real pressure points were, not in the loud protests or the flashy news segments, not in the empty gossip of courthouse break rooms. Power hid in back offices, in donor circles, in the quiet whispers of political brokers who pulled strings behind velvet curtains. And Elijah Reed knew all their names. He started with the old guard, men and women who still owed him favors from decades past, favors they had tried to forget until the day he called them in, one by one. Elijah made the calls, short, direct. "This is Elijah Reed. You owe me. It is time to pay. No threats, no explanations. Just the cold reminder of debt still lingering in the corners of their memory." And they listened, because Elijah was not a man you crossed lightly, not then, not now. Within 48 hours, pressure began to mount inside the political circles of Harbor Bay. Phone calls buzzed through law offices and city council meetings. Emails moved like whispered prayers from inbox to inbox. Questions began to rise. Who really leaked the fake videos? Who authorized the anonymous complaints? Who would benefit if Naomi Reed was taken down? The system that had moved so eagerly to erase her suddenly found itself under scrutiny. Elijah also knew the streets, the real streets, not the polished sidewalks of downtown, but the neighborhoods where names still mattered more than titles. He met with community leaders, pastors, organizers. He sat in folding chairs in church basements. He leaned against brick walls outside barbershops. He told them the story, the truth. A daughter standing alone against a machine built to silence her. A daughter carrying not just her own dignity, but the hopes of every kid who had ever been told they did not belong. And the community listened. Because when Elijah Reed spoke, you did not just hear his words, you felt the weight of the battles behind them. Within days, rallies began to form, but not the kind the courthouse protesters expected. These were not angry mobs. These were families, students, veterans, mothers and grandmothers in Sunday hats, standing shoulder to shoulder with young men in hoodies and worn sneakers. They carried signs too. Protect Judge Reed. Truth matters. We belong here. And for every angry voice shouting her down, two more rose to lift her up. The media, sensing a shift, started asking different questions. Not about Naomi's supposed misconduct, but about why a sitting judge was being targeted with such fury and why the courthouse refused to comment on the origins of the attacks. Reporters who had once parroted the accusations now smelled blood in the water, but not Naomi's. The narrative was shifting, slowly, inevitably. Inside the courthouse, the air changed. The faces that once smirked at Naomi in the halls now looked away, nervous. The attorneys who once interrupted her in hearings grew quieter, more cautious, because they could feel it too. The storm they had unleashed was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to someone else now. One afternoon, as Naomi finished presiding over a difficult sentencing, she returned to her chambers to find a small envelope on her desk. No name, no markings. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. It read, "We stand with you." Beneath the words were dozens of signatures, clerks, assistants, junior lawyers, even a few brave judges. Naomi stared at it for a long time, not because it erased the cruelty, not because it fixed what had been broken, but because it proved something deeper. They had tried to isolate her, and they had failed, because dignity, once claimed, becomes contagious, because courage, once shown, cannot be unseen. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Harbor Bay, Naomi stood at her office window and watched the world outside. The protests were still there, the ugly signs, the shouted lies, but woven between them now were different voices, louder, stronger, voices that refused to be drowned out. Elijah Reed had not fought her battle for her. He had simply reminded the world that she was not fighting alone. Naomi smiled to herself, a small, fierce smile. The battle was not over. The machine would not surrender easily. But for the first time in weeks, Naomi Reed did not feel like she was carrying the weight alone. She felt the ground shifting under her feet, not giving way, rising up. And she knew when a shadow wakes, it does not come to beg. It comes to reclaim what should never have been stolen. Elijah Reed was not done. Winning the support of the streets was one thing, but Elijah understood you could not bring down a system unless you struck at its foundation. So he went deeper. He reached out to an old friend, Vanessa Torres, a veteran investigative journalist who owed Elijah more than one favor from the old days. The kind of journalist who didn't chase gossip, but hunted truth like a wolf tracking blood. It took only one meeting, one battered manila folder placed in her hands. Inside that folder was the real story. The forged complaints against Naomi, the fake witnesses tied to former Officer Dalton, the doctored footage paid for by political donors desperate to preserve the old order. It was all there. Black ink on white pages, cold, undeniable proof. Vanessa worked fast, and by Sunday morning, the front page of Harbor Bay's largest newspaper screamed a headline that shook the city awake. Exposed campaign to destroy judge, Reed unravels subhead documents, link courthouse insiders to smear effort. The article laid it all bare. Names, dates, amounts of money exchanged, phone records, emails. No denials could bury it now. The courthouse that had once moved in shadows now found itself dragged into the burning light. Public opinion shifted like a landslide. One by one, the faces that had sneered at Naomi began scrambling to cover their tracks. Statements were issued. Resignations filed. Investigations launched not into Naomi, but into those who had sought to destroy her. The protesters outside the courthouse thinned, their numbers shrinking with each news cycle. The signs changed too. Now they read, "We stand with Reed accountability for all justice demands better." Inside the courthouse, Naomi walked the halls with her head high. The stares she received now were different. Not hostile, not pitying, respectful, because everyone knew she had survived the storm, she had endured the fire, and she had never once bowed. One afternoon, Elijah waited for her outside the courthouse steps. He stood leaning against the battered Lincoln, arms crossed, a small, proud smile playing on his face. Naomi approached him, her robe trailing slightly behind her, her hoodie still snug beneath it. "It is not over," she said softly. "No," Elijah agreed, "but the ground is ours now." She smiled a smile filled with weariness and triumph all at once. "You did this," she said. Elijah shook his head. "No, we did this. You stood your ground when they wanted you broken. You made them show who they really were. I just made sure the world was watching." Naomi looked out over the city, her city breathing in the cool autumn air. The courthouse loomed behind her, scarred but still standing, and so was she. "They will come again," she said, more softly. "Different faces, different lies." "They always do," Elijah said. "That's the nature of it." Then he leaned in closer, his voice low and certain. "But now they know every time they come for you, they'll have to face all of us. And that changes everything." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle into her bones. They did not erase what had been done. They did not heal every wound. But they carved a new path forward, one paved not by fear, but by stubborn, enduring hope. Later that night, as Naomi sat alone in her apartment, the city lights flickering beyond her window, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. She pulled the old hoodie tighter around her shoulders, the fabric worn soft with years. It was not a costume. It was not a weapon. It was a memory, a promise, a shield. Outside, the city roared on, sirens wailing, neon buzzing, voices rising and falling like waves, and Naomi Reed sat steady against it all. They had tried to erase her. They had tried to shame her. They had tried to make her small, but all they had done was wake the legacy sleeping inside her, the legacy of every ancestor who had refused to kneel, the legacy of every battle fought with bare hands and steel hearts, the legacy of a girl who learned that dignity is not given. It is claimed, and once claimed, it is never surrendered, not to fear, not to lies, not to cowards hiding behind broken systems. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new storms. Naomi was ready, because once the shadow wakes, it does not sleep again. It grows, it strengthens, and it moves through the world as a reminder. You cannot bury what refuses to die. You cannot silence what was born to speak. And you cannot stop a Black woman in a hoodie who knows the full power of her story. It began with a name, not Naomi's, theirs. The names of the ones who had pulled the strings, the ones who had whispered lies into the right ears, the ones who thought power made them untouchable. The newspaper article dropped those names like stones into a still pond, and the ripples were immediate. First to fall was Assistant District Attorney Martin Kell, the man who had smiled at Naomi in meetings, then drafted anonymous complaints in back rooms. An internal audit found a trail of misconduct, a mile-long doctored case files, preferential treatment for politically connected defendants, a pattern of weaponizing charges against those who dared to speak out. By noon, he was escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, his face pale, his mouth tight with rage he could no longer hide. The news crews captured every second. The same cameras that once hunted Naomi now turned their lenses on him. No sympathy, no excuses. Only cold, public justice. The next was Officer Stephen Grant, the man who had vandalized Naomi's car and shoved doctored evidence into courthouse channels. Anonymous no longer, his own union, under pressure from the growing scandal, withdrew support. An investigation revealed a history of disciplinary actions buried under layers of bureaucratic favors. Grant resigned within 48 hours, his pension under review, his future uncertain, and the hits kept coming. The political donors who funded the smear campaign exposed, the courthouse administrators who turned blind eyes suspended pending inquiry, the judge who hosted the secret meetings against Naomi forced into early retirement under public pressure. It was not just a fall, it was a collapse, a rotten system rotting in the open air for all to see. Inside the courthouse, Naomi Reed moved with the same steady, deliberate grace she always had. She did not gloat. She did not celebrate. She simply did what she had always done, showed up, took her seat, carried herself with the quiet power of someone who knows the truth needs no defense. Those who had once mocked her now offered thin, awkward nods as she passed. The courthouse buzzed with fear, not of Naomi, but of what she represented. Accountability. The one thing they had spent their lives believing they were immune to, and Naomi never had to lift her voice, never had to shout. Her silence did the work for her. One afternoon, she crossed paths with Judge Raymond Kent in the hallway. The man who had once tried to corner her into resignation now avoided her gaze. His shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his own survival instincts. Naomi paused as he tried to sidestep her. "Judge Kent," she said quietly. He froze. She let the silence stretch for a long, unbearable second before adding, "Truth has a way of finding its voice, even in the darkest halls." She left him standing there, words caught useless in his throat. Later that week, Naomi received an official letter from the Judicial Oversight Committee, not an accusation, not a warning, a commendation for professionalism, for resilience, for unwavering adherence to the principles of justice under extraordinary pressure. Naomi read the letter once, then folded it neatly and tucked it into a drawer. She did not need their approval, but she would keep the proof that standing her ground had not just survived the storm, it had changed its direction. Outside, the protests were gone. The media frenzy had moved on to newer scandals, easier targets, and yet, something in Harbor Bay had shifted permanently. You could feel it in the way young black clerks walked taller through the courthouse. You could hear it in the whispered stories shared in barbershops and living rooms, the story of a judge who stood alone against a system built to erase her and refused to move. The story of a black woman in a hoodie who wore her dignity like armor. And in the quiet moments, Naomi would sit by her window, watching the sun set over the city she had refused to abandon. She would sip her coffee, feel the steady rhythm of her own breath, and know they had tried to bury her. But they forgot she was not a seed. She was the storm, and the roots she had planted now stretched deep beneath Harbor Bay, too deep for them to rip out, too strong for them to ever ignore again. As the dust settled over Harbor Bay, the true shape of the fall became clear. It was not just the careers that crumbled. It was the silence that had once shielded them. People started talking now. Clerks whispered about years of bias buried under bureaucratic smiles. Young lawyers shared stories of cases quietly reassigned, verdicts gently nudged, justice bent into shapes it was never meant to take. The system, once so polished on the surface, now lay exposed, cracked, rusted, bleeding from wounds it had hidden for decades. And at the center of it all, standing still and silent, was Naomi Reed. Not as a victor gloating over the fallen, not as a symbol polished and paraded, but as a reminder of what it costs to survive, and of why survival alone is never enough. One afternoon, a young clerk knocked timidly at Naomi's office door. "Judge Reed," she said, voice trembling slightly. Could I just say thank you?" Naomi looked up from her paperwork, setting down her pen carefully. For what she asked, her voice gentle, the girl hesitated, then squared her shoulders. For not leaving, for not giving up, for making it so we don't have to be afraid to try anymore. Naomi smiled not wide, but deep. Thank you, she said simply. After the girl left, Naomi sat there for a long moment, the late afternoon sun slanting through her window, casting long shadows across the floor. She thought about all the times she had nearly walked away, all the times it would have been easier, safer to fold under the weight, but easy was not why she had come here, and safety was never promised to those who chose to carry their dignity like a flag into a battlefield. Across town, the fallout continued. Martin Kell's disbarment hearings began. Officer Grant faced criminal charges. The political donors found their names blacklisted from polite society, their power shriveled under public scrutiny. And yet, Naomi knew real change was not measured by how many fell. It was measured by how many rose afterward. In the weeks that followed, new policies were introduced, mandatory bias training for courthouse staff, stricter oversight of judicial complaints, clearer protections for judges facing harassment or smear campaigns. Small steps, fragile steps, but steps nonetheless. And every step carried the echo of Naomi's fight. One evening, Naomi attended a community forum at a local church, the same kind of gathering where her enemies had once tried to paint her as a radical. She stood at the podium, the worn wood warm under her hands, and looked out at the crowd. There were elders in Sunday best, teenagers in hoodies and sneakers, young mothers with babies bouncing on their hips, old men with weathered faces and sharp eyes, all of them watching, waiting, believing. Naomi spoke simply, no grand speeches, no sweeping promises, just the truth. They tried to tell me I didn't belong. She said, they tried to make me believe that justice had no place for someone who looked like me, who lived like me. She paused, letting the words settle into the room. But justice does not belong to those who built walls to keep us out. Justice belongs to those who never stopped demanding a door be opened. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but fierce. I did not stay because it was easy. I stayed because every time they pushed, I remembered every person who had pushed before me harder, longer, with less. She smiled in a real, full smile, and I remembered we do not walk alone. We never did. Applause swelled through the church, rising like a tide, carrying with it a fierce, joyful noise. After the event, as Naomi stepped out into the cool night air, Elijah Reed was waiting by the curb, leaning casually against his battered Lincoln. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a nod. Pride without fanfare, love without condition. Naomi walked toward him, her robe billowing slightly in the breeze, the familiar weight of her hoodie wrapped close. She wasn't just walking away from a battle. She was walking toward something bigger, a future not yet written, a story not yet finished, a legacy carried forward not by the noise of hatred, but by the silent, unstoppable power of endurance. And as the city lights flickered around her, Naomi Reed knew the fall they had tried to force on her had become their own, and she was still rising, still walking, still unbreakable. Fall does not happen all at once. It cracks first, a fissure here, a splinter there, a small collapse under the weight of something too long ignored. And then, in one sharp moment, it all gives way. That moment came 2 weeks later. The state judicial board, after a brief but highly publicized review, announced sweeping changes across the Harbor Bay Courthouse. New leadership, mandatory ethics oversight, public transparency and disciplinary procedures. It was an unprecedented rebuke. And though Naomi Reed's name was never formally mentioned in the official statement, everyone knew this was her doing, not through speeches, not through protests, not through riots or rage, through endurance, through presence, through the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear. On the morning the reforms were announced, Naomi walked into the courthouse under a different sky. The protesters were gone. The cameras, for the most part, had turned away to chase newer scandals. What remained were the people who mattered, the clerks who now lifted their heads a little higher, the young attorneys who no longer mumbled apologies when they crossed her path, the defendants, especially the young black and brown men, who looked at her with something more than fear now. They looked at her with recognition, with hope. Naomi moved through the halls without fanfare, her robe flowing around her, her old gray hoodie still wrapped underneath. A quiet rebellion she wore like second skin. She presided over her cases as she always had, firmly, fairly, without bias or bitterness. But now, every decision carried extra weight because she knew they were watching, learning, building. That afternoon, during a short recess, Naomi found herself on the courthouse steps, looking out over the city. The fall wind tugged gently at her robe, at the hoodie underneath, whispering promises she had once been too tired to believe in. Beside her, Elijah Reed leaned against the railing, arms crossed, face calm. He said nothing. He didn't have to. They both knew. They had won something here. Not everything, not forever, but something real, something lasting. Naomi turned toward him, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. "You think they learned anything?" she asked. Elijah chuckled low in his chest, that rough sound of hard-earned wisdom. "They learned they can't come for you cheap," he said. "They learned it'll cost them more than they ever thought possible." Naomi nodded slowly. "That's enough," she said. "For now." Elijah tilted his head, studying her. "You're not done yet, are you?" Naomi smiled, a small, dangerous thing. "Not even close." He grinned wide, the pride in his eyes impossible to hide. "That's my girl." The next day, Naomi received a quiet message from the State Bar Association, an invitation. Would she consider serving on the newly formed Judicial Equity and Accountability Commission, a position of influence, a platform to ensure what happened to her would not happen to others? Naomi sat with the letter for a long time, feeling the weight of it. She thought about the battles she had fought, the nights she had wondered if it was worth it, the moments she had nearly folded under the loneliness. And she thought about every kid watching her now, silent and unseen, waiting for proof that standing firm meant something. She picked up a pen, signed her name, and sealed another crack they had once thought would swallow her whole. As she walked through the courthouse that afternoon, a young boy, maybe 12, skinny, nervous, ran up to her as she reached the main steps. He wore an oversized hoodie, sleeves dragging past his hands. He looked up at her, wide-eyed, breathless. "Ma'am," he said, stumbling over the word. Naomi crouched slightly so they were eye level. "Yes," the boy hesitated, then said, "My teacher told us your story, told us how you didn't quit, told us you stayed." He shuffled his feet, embarrassed. I just wanted to say thank you." Naomi smiled, something warm blooming in her chest. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jalen," he said. "Well, Jalen," Naomi said, "someday, someone's going to tell your story too." His face lit up, hope and disbelief and fierce, stubborn pride all tangled together. Naomi stood and ruffled his hair lightly. "Stay strong, Jalen, always," he whispered. As the boy darted away, Naomi turned back to the courthouse steps. The building stood there, battered but standing, just like her. And Naomi Reed, hoodie and robe and all, climbed those steps once again, not alone. Never alone again, because the fall was theirs. But the future was hers, and she was just getting started. The real battles are never won in headlines, not in viral clips, not in viral outrage. The real victories live in the quiet, in the moments no one records, in the spaces where choices are made without an audience. Naomi Reed understood that now better than ever. She had not set out to become a symbol. She had not asked to carry the weight of anyone's hopes on her shoulders. She had simply refused to disappear. And sometimes, that is the most revolutionary act of all. As fall turned to winter in Harbor Bay, Naomi found herself asked to speak more and more at schools, at community forums, even at judicial conferences where the air was thick with the tension of people not used to hearing hard truths. She always started the same way. No notes, no speeches, just a story, her story, the story of standing in a room full of power and being told, without words, that she did not belong. The story of standing anyway. The story of understanding that dignity is not something you are given. It is something you decide to wear. One evening, standing before a packed auditorium of high school seniors, most of them black, most of them wearing hoodies and sneakers just like she once had, Naomi looked out over the sea of young faces and felt a deep, aching responsibility settle into her chest. She leaned into the microphone, voice low and steady. You will be told you are too loud, too quiet, too angry, too soft. You will be told to sit down, to step aside, to wait your turn. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. They will tell you that survival is enough, that keeping your head down is the same thing as winning. She shook her head slowly, her eyes sweeping the room. It is not. She let the silence stretch. It is not enough to survive. We are not here just to survive. We are here to live, to lead, to take up space without apology. A murmur of energy ran through the auditorium. Naomi smiled small. Fierce. Some of you will be called troublemakers. She said, some of you will be called arrogant. Some of you will be called ungrateful. Good. Let them call you whatever they need to call you to make themselves feel better. You remember who you are. She tapped her chest lightly. You are the legacy of every ancestor who refused to kneel. You are the dream that every system of oppression tried and failed to erase. And you are the future they cannot stop. The applause rose not polite, not formal. It rose like thunder, deep and raw, from the soles of their shoes to the beams of the ceiling. Naomi stepped back from the microphone, letting their voices carry forward, letting them taste what it felt like to claim a space that had so often been denied to them. Later that night, alone in her modest apartment, Naomi sat by the window, hoodie wrapped around her, robe hanging on a simple wooden hook by the door. She sipped tea, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, and reflected on the lessons she had been forced to learn, not the lessons taught in law school, not the ones taught in courtrooms filled with marble and ceremony, the real lessons, that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is strategy, that dignity is not passive. It is active. It is a daily decision. That power does not only belong to those who shout the loudest, it belongs to those who endure, to those who stand even when standing feels like the loneliest act in the world, to those who understand that being underestimated is not a disadvantage, it is armor. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, victory is not measured by how many enemies fall at your feet. It is measured by how many doors you hold open behind you, by how many voices rise because yours refuse to be silenced. As the city lights flickered outside, Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of life wash over her. She had walked through fire. She had stood in the storm. She had seen the best and the worst of a system that promised justice, but often delivered something colder. And yet she was still here, still standing, still carrying a story stitched into every thread of her hoodie, every fold of her robe. A story not just of pain, but of possibility. A story that would not end with her, because the lesson was never about Naomi Reed alone. It was about every person who would hear her story and realize that they, too, could stand, that they, too, could refuse to bow. that they, too, could claim their space loudly, quietly, defiantly, proudly. And once you know that, once you truly believe it, no one can ever take it from you again. In the weeks that followed, Naomi Reed became something she had never intended to be, a symbol, not the kind plastered on billboards or sculpted into monuments, but a living, breathing reminder of what it meant to endure without losing yourself. Her story traveled beyond Harbor Bay, shared in classrooms, discussed in town halls, whispered in circles where hope often flickered on the edge of extinction, and each retelling sharpened the real lesson: you do not have to be loud to be heard. You do not have to fight with fists to change the fight. You only have to refuse to move when the world demands you shrink. One Saturday morning, Naomi visited a small community center tucked into the heart of the city, a place where young people gathered after school, seeking safety and belonging. The room buzzed with nervous energy when she entered. Kids, some wearing hoodies like armor, others clutching notebooks like shields, looked up at her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Naomi smiled warmly. She knew that look. It was the same one she had worn at their age. Every time someone who had survived the fire walked into her world and showed her it was possible, she sat on the edge of a battered folding chair. No podium between them, no distance. Today, she said, I am not here as a judge. She paused, letting them settle into the truth of her words. Today, I am here as a girl who once sat where you sit now, wondering if the world would ever make room for her, wondering if surviving was the best she could hope for. A girl who was told to be grateful for scraps, told not to make noise, told to take what was given and ask for nothing more. A murmur of understanding moved through the room. Naomi leaned forward slightly. I'm here to tell you, survival is just the beginning. You are not meant to survive the world as it is. You are meant to change it. A hand shot up timidly from the back. A girl, maybe 15, with bright, questioning eyes. But how, the girl asked, how do you change something that's so big and so broken? Naomi nodded slowly, honoring the weight of the question, one step at a time. She said, one room at a time, one refusal to bow at a time. She smiled gently. You change it by standing where they tell you not to stand, by speaking when they tell you to be silent, by existing fully and unapologetically in spaces they said were not made for you. Another hand rose. A boy this time, his voice cracking with uncertainty. But what if it's scary? Naomi chuckled softly, the sound warm and real. It will be, she said. If it's not scary, you're not aiming high enough. She let the laughter ripple through the room before adding, voice soft but sure, fear is not the enemy. Fear is the proof you're moving in the right direction. A heavy silence followed, not awkward, sacred. Because somewhere deep inside, each of them understood, maybe for the first time, that fear was not a sign to retreat. It was a sign to rise. Afterward, a few of them lingered, asking questions, sharing dreams too fragile to voice anywhere else. Naomi listened to everyone, not as a judge, as a mirror, as proof. When she finally stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, Naomi found Elijah Reed waiting near the curb, arms folded, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. How'd it go, he asked. Naomi shrugged lightly, a twinkle in her eye. I think they taught me more than I taught them, Elijah chuckled, clapping a firm hand on her shoulder. That's how you know you're doing it right. They stood together for a moment, watching the kids pour out of the center, laughing, teasing, chasing each other into the rest of the day. Life, noisy and chaotic and beautiful, spilling forward. Naomi felt a quiet certainty settle into her bones. This was the real victory, not the headlines, not the reforms. This, planting seeds in soil others had once salted and left for dead, choosing to believe that from the ruins, something stronger could grow, and standing there under the open sky, Naomi Reed understood the final piece of the lesson. The fight is never just about surviving today. It is about building a tomorrow where fewer battles must be fought, where more dreams can breathe freely, where the next girl in the hoodie will not have to wonder if she belongs. She will know she does. Naomi took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cold, clean air of a city that was learning slowly, painfully to see her, and she smiled. Tomorrow would bring new storms, new fights, new fires. She was ready because she carried the lesson now, stitched into every fiber of who she was. Never ask permission to exist. Never surrender the space you have earned. And never ever bow your head, unless it is to lift someone else higher. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Naomi Reed felt something shift, not just in the courthouse, not just in the city, but inside herself. It was not triumph, not celebration. It was steadiness, the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself, the kind that roots deep, deeper than fear, deeper than pain. She moved through her days with the same quiet purpose that had carried her through the storm, but now, every step she took was a reminder not just to herself, but to everyone watching that endurance is a language, and Naomi spoke it fluently. One evening, after a long day of hearings and meetings, Naomi sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The news played softly in the background. Another city, another protest, another young voice rising against the old weight of injustice. She watched for a moment, her heart heavy but hopeful. The faces on the screen were young, determined, unwilling to wait their turn any longer. Naomi smiled, setting the cup down gently. This was the real legacy, not buildings named after you, not plaques or ceremonies, but the fire you leave burning in others. The courage you pass down without even knowing it. She rose from the table and crossed to the window, looking out over Harbor Bay's twinkling skyline. It looked the same, and yet it wasn't, because now she saw the small changes. The clerk who no longer apologized for speaking up, the young black attorney who walked into her courtroom without lowering his gaze, the teenage girl who wore her hoodie into the gallery like a crown instead of a disguise. Small things, real things. Proof that standing tall had not been in vain. Naomi thought back to all the nights she had almost given in, the nights the silence felt like a wall too high to scale, the days when even breathing felt like an act of rebellion. And yet she had kept breathing, kept walking, kept standing, not because she was fearless, but because fear had no longer been enough to stop her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Maya, her loyal clerk, standing there with a tired but bright smile. "Sorry to bother you so late," Maya said, holding up a thick envelope. "Just wanted you to see this." Naomi took the envelope, frowning slightly. Inside was a collection of handwritten letters, bundled neatly with twine. She pulled out the first one. It was from a young woman studying pre-law at a local college. "Thank you for making me believe I belong in a courtroom." It read, "Thank you for not disappearing." Another letter, "Thank you for wearing your hoodie when they told you to hide it." Another, "Thank you for showing me that strength doesn't have to shout." Letter after letter, voice after voice, people Naomi had never met, people she would never meet, reaching out across the space between them to say, "We saw you. We believe because you stayed." Naomi blinked back the sting of tears, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the letters carefully back into the envelope. She looked at Maya, who stood watching her, eyes shining. "You did more than survive," Maya said softly. "You changed the weather." Naomi laughed quietly, the sound thick with emotion. "I just stood still," she said. Maya shook her head. "No, you stood when it mattered, and that made all the difference." They sat together for a while. No more words needed, letting the silence settle around them, not heavy this time, not lonely, full, alive. Later that night, alone again, Naomi returned to the window. She pulled her old gray hoodie tighter around her shoulders. Not to hide, not to shield, to honor. It was not just fabric. It was memory. It was battle armor. It was the quiet flag of a woman who had dared to claim space and refused to yield it back. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the cool night air seeping through the glass. She thought of the young ones coming behind her, the ones she might never meet, the ones who would never know the full weight of what had been carried to clear a little more sky for them. And she smiled, not a smile of victory, a smile of peace, because she understood now. Fully and without doubt, the greatest lesson she had learned was not how to fight. It was how to stay, how to be, how to root herself so deeply in her own worth that no storm, no lie, no cruelty could uproot her, and how to leave behind something better than what she had inherited. Tomorrow would come, new fights would rise, but Naomi Reed, judge, daughter, survivor, warrior in a hoodie would meet them the same way she always had, not with noise, not with fury, but with a silent, unbreakable power that could not be erased, because the real victory was never just surviving. It was leaving a path for others to follow, one worn smooth by courage, one lit by quiet, relentless hope, one that said to anyone who needed to hear it, "You are not alone. You never were, and you never will be." The city woke slow and heavy under a thick morning mist. The streets of Harbor Bay, usually sharp with the clatter of cars and chatter, moved in a muted hum, as if the world itself paused to breathe. Naomi Reed stepped out of her building, hoodie up against the chill, hands tucked deep into the pockets of her coat. No robe today, no podiums, no crowds, just her, moving through a city that had once tried to erase her, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her sneakers struck the pavement in a steady rhythm, blending into the early morning sounds, a street vendor rattling his cart, a bus sighing as it pulled to a stop, the distant bark of a dog chasing something unseen. She was anonymous here, and that was exactly how she wanted it, because the real work, the real living, is not done under spotlights. It is done in the walking, in the simple, stubborn act of showing up day after day when the world would rather you disappear. As Naomi moved through the city, she passed by places that now carried pieces of her story. The courthouse steps, once a gauntlet of jeers, now quiet, almost reverent. The community center where young girls in hoodies now stood at the podium, practicing speeches too bold to be contained. The coffee shop where the same clerks who once whispered behind her back now greeted her with cautious, genuine smiles, each place a marker, not of battles won easily, but of ground claimed step by step, breath by breath. Naomi paused at a small park near the center of town. Children played under the watchful eyes of tired parents and weathered benches. A boy zipped past her on a warm bicycle, hoodie flapping behind him like a cape. She smiled. There was a time, not long ago, when a black child in a hoodie was seen first as a threat, when the fabric itself carried fear heavier than armor. But today here, in this small corner of Harbor Bay, it was just cloth, just a boy riding his bike, chasing the last bits of summer before winter swallowed the city whole. Naomi sat down on a bench, pulling her hood lower over her eyes, letting the world move around her without asking anything of her. She thought about the road ahead, about the commissions she had agreed to serve on, about the quiet battles still waiting in policy meetings and boardrooms, about the new generation rising young, unafraid, carrying the lessons she had bled for without even knowing her name. And she thought about herself, about what it meant to have survived, not polished, not untouched, scarred, changed, better. Because survival without change is just enduring. And Naomi Reed had not endured just to stay the same. She had walked through fire to become someone who could walk others through it too. Across the park, a teenage girl caught her eye. Hoodie up, backpack slung low, walking with the careful wariness Naomi knew too well. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that flicker of connection, Naomi saw the question she had asked herself 1,000 times when she was younger. Can I really do this? Can I survive this world without losing myself? Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply nodded once, a small, certain movement. I see you. You are enough. Keep going. The girl hesitated, then smiled quick and fierce before disappearing into the city streets. Naomi leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the sun, weak and stubborn, warm her face, letting herself really believe that maybe, just maybe, she had left the world a little better than she found it. Maybe not in ways that would make history books, maybe not in ways that would earn statues or awards, but in ways that mattered, in ways that endured. She rose after a while, brushing off her jeans, pulling her hoodie tighter against the creeping chill, and without ceremony, without noise, Naomi Reed stepped back into the rhythm of the city, walking steady, walking sure, walking forward. Because some stories do not end with fanfare. They end with a figure in a hoodie moving through a city that could not break her, moving toward whatever comes next, carrying every lesson, every scar, every quiet victory inside her, and never, not for a single step, walking alone again. Naomi Reed walked through the heart of Harbor Bay like she had always belonged there, not because the city had made room for her, but because she had claimed her space without permission. The sidewalks buzzed with the ordinary rhythms of life vendors calling out prices, buses rumbling past, laughter spilling from open cafe doors. Naomi moved unnoticed, wrapped in her worn gray hoodie, her presence blending into the pulse of the streets. And yet, everywhere she went, tiny pieces of change shimmered like broken sunlight. Outside the courthouse, a group of young law interns gathered under the old oak tree, books open on their laps, deep in debate. Among them were faces Naomi would not have seen a year ago, faces carrying stories of struggle, of pride, of belonging. At the library, she glimpsed a flyer pinned to a bulletin board. Know Your Rights workshop, hosted by first-year law students determined to make sure no one else had to stand alone in the storm. At the coffee shop, the barista who once refused to meet her eyes now greeted her with a smile and a genuine, easy respect. Small things, real things, proof that presence alone, stubborn, quiet, unapologetic, can shift the ground under a city's feet. Naomi crossed the main square, the winter wind tugging at her hoodie, and found herself drawn toward the community mural taking shape against a brick wall. It had started just weeks ago, a grassroots project, fueled by volunteers and donations. No official sponsors, no press releases, just color. Spilling out of spray cans and battered paintbrushes, the mural told a story of marches and vigils, of raised fists and open hands, of hoodies and robes standing side by side. At the center of it all, barely outlined but unmistakable, was a figure walking forward, a woman in a hoodie, not bowed, not broken, moving, always moving. Naomi stood before it for a long time, the noise of the street fading into a low, distant hum. Someone must have noticed her standing there, because a voice spoke softly beside her. Beautiful, isn't it? Naomi turned to find an older woman, her gray hair tucked under a bright scarf, her face lined with the kind of wisdom you cannot fake. She smiled kindly at Naomi, then turned her eyes back to the wall. They say it's not finished yet. The woman said, they're leaving the figure open. So it can be anyone. So it can be all of us. Naomi swallowed hard, feeling the lump rise in her throat. That's the point, she whispered. The woman glanced at her, a glint of knowing in her eye. Maybe it started with one, she said, but it never ends with just one. Naomi nodded, her chest tight with something too big for words. The woman patted her shoulder gently, then shuffled off, blending back into the life of the square. Naomi stayed a moment longer, staring at the unfinished figure on the wall. She thought about all the battles fought quietly in corners no one noticed, about all the stories still waiting to be told. She thought about the generations coming behind her, the ones who would not ask if they belonged, but walk in knowing they did, because someone had walked first. Not perfectly, not without pain, but without giving up. Naomi pulled her hoodie tighter and stepped back into the flow of the crowd. A little girl bumped into her side, nearly dropping a bundle of books. Naomi bent quickly, steadying her. "You okay?" she asked. The girl grinned, cheeks flushed from running. "Yeah, thanks." She darted off, her small body wrapped in a hoodie 2 sizes too big, sleeves flapping like wings. Naomi watched her go, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. That's how it spreads. Not through laws alone, not through headlines, through moments, through stories, through the simple, stubborn act of moving forward, of refusing to vanish. Naomi walked on, past the mural, past the courthouse, past the coffee shops and playgrounds and bus stops. Each step planting something stronger than roots, memory, possibility, a challenge. Somewhere ahead, new storms would gather, new gates would be built to keep people like her out. But Naomi knew now she carried the key inside her. She always had. And so, without fanfare, without a backward glance, she kept moving. Hoodie up, head high, heart open, because the lesson was not survival, it was continuation. It was legacy. It was walking through the world as living proof that dignity, once claimed, could never be stolen again. Not by fear, not by hatred, not by history, and in every step Naomi Reed took, she carried a silent promise to everyone watching. The hoodie walks on, and so will we. The sun dipped low behind Harbor Bay's skyline, casting the city in long gold shadows. Naomi Reed moved through the streets without urgency, her footsteps blending into the fading hum of evening life. She passed shuttered shops, kids laughing under broken streetlights, old men playing chess on cracked sidewalks. Life, in all its imperfect beauty, moving forward. As she walked, Naomi thought about the beginning, about that first day, the slap, the stairs, the long, aching silence, about the weight she had carried through courtrooms and conference rooms, in meetings where her voice was treated like an inconvenience instead of a truth. She thought about the humiliation, the loneliness, the fear, and she thought about the choice she had made, the choice she kept making every day, to stay, to stand, to be seen, not as a savior, not as a symbol, but simply as herself, whole, unapologetic, real. Naomi turned onto a quiet street where the city's noise gave way to stillness. In the distance, the old mural glowed under street lamps, still unfinished, still alive, still waiting for new hands to add to its story. She paused at a small corner store, the windows fogged with years of fingerprints and dreams. Inside, a radio played softly. A news anchor's voice drifted through the glass. Significant reforms inspired by the perseverance of Judge Naomi Reed. Naomi smiled faintly, not at the recognition, but at the reminder that what she had endured mattered, that standing your ground, even when it feels invisible, leaves ripples too wide for history to ignore. She kept moving, her hoodie pulled low against the rising night chill. Up ahead, a small group of teenagers clustered near a bus stop, laughing and shoving each other with the easy bravado of youth. One boy caught sight of her, a tall, Lanky kid in a faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that brief moment, Naomi saw it again, that flicker of recognition, of belonging, of silent thanks. He didn't know her story in full. Maybe he never would. But he knew enough. Knew that someone had stood so he could. Knew that the world, cracked and bleeding as it still was, had been nudged a little wider, a little kinder, because someone refused to shrink. Naomi tipped her head slightly in greeting. The boy straightened his shoulders, just a little, and Naomi walked on, block after block, street after street. Her figure became smaller against the sprawl of the city, her footsteps swallowed by the night. But the echo of her presence remained, in the courthouse halls, in the painted walls, in the hearts of every young girl pulling a hoodie over her head and stepping into a world that might not yet be ready, but would have to make room anyway. Because once a path is carved, it stays. Maybe faint at first, maybe overgrown with time, but there, waiting. Naomi's journey was not over. New fights would rise, new storms would gather. She would not win every battle. She was never meant to, because the fight was never just about her. It was about the space she cleared, the lessons she left, the silent invitation she extended with every step. Come, walk further, stand taller, be louder if you choose, or stand silent, but unbowed. Either way, move, move forward, move free. As Naomi reached the crest of a small hill overlooking the city, she paused. Harbor Bay stretched out before her, battered, imperfect, still learning, just like her. The breeze tugged at the edges of her hoodie, whispering promises of roads still unwritten. Naomi tucked her hands deeper into her pockets, closed her eyes for one brief moment, and breathed, not the breath of survival, the breath of someone who has claimed her place in the world and knows it cannot be taken away. When she opened her eyes, the last light of day clung stubbornly to the skyline, painting the city in soft golds and bruised purples. Naomi Reed smiled. Not because it was over, but because it was not. Because the story, her story, their story was still being written with every step forward, and without a word, without a sound. Naomi Reed walked on, hoodie up, spirit steady, unbreakable, and somewhere behind her, and somewhere ahead of her, the path stretched wide and sure, a road built not from permission, but from power, silent, enduring, free. Sometimes the loudest battles are fought in silence. Sometimes the strongest victories are claimed by simply refusing to move. Naomi Reed's story reminds us that real power isn't about noise. It isn't about spectacle. It's about standing quietly, fiercely when the world demands you fall. It's about walking forward even when every step feels like it carries the weight of generations. And it's about understanding that every time you stand your ground, you leave a path for someone else to follow, a path that says you are enough, you belong here, you are never walking alone. If Naomi's story moved you, if you believe that quiet courage can change the world, then join us. Subscribe to Silent Power Stories. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that survival is not surrender. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that carries the power of resilience, hope, and unbreakable spirit. Because out there, right now, someone is standing at the edge of giving up. And maybe your voice, your presence, your choice to share hope is exactly what keeps them walking forward. Thank you for being part of this journey. The hoodie walks on, and so do we.